Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Today, as you can see here by the graphic, we're going to discuss a number of indigenous poets that I think are really exemplary of what is deemed the indigenous poetry Renaissance or the Native American Renaissance. And as you know, Renaissance just really means a rebirth. Uh, the idea of a Renaissance in poetry and in literature, uh, for that matter, and it's the larger concept in literature, not just poetry, uh, has taken place a number of times in North America, but specifically in America. And we had the um, African American, what was called the Heartland Renaissance that took place in the 60s and 70s. And it's really this large body of work that's being produced that's part of that group. In this case, it would be Indigenous or Native American. So just a few things to give some sort of ground level foundation of what is involved with the Indigenous poetry Renaissance. When we talk about Indigenous poetry, I think there are a number of themes and other concepts that we should cover, and in which we can be considered part of the Indigenous Renaissance, what's called the tradition, right? To include the poet or the speaker through the poetry, grappling with such concepts as, and these will be important to understand, and we're going to parse from the various poets that we're going to look at today from their poems. They're grappling with the idea of personal identity of the Native American or indigenous people. Trying to understand their cultural heritage would be an important brand that's part of indigenous poetry. Remembrance and connecting with a shared cultural past, so connecting with their past, connecting with their oral history, understanding how important the oral history is, because that allows them to have personal identity. If you understand where you came from, you understand who you are in the present. The idea of being marginalized by society at large. We see this with the reservation life emerging out of a period of subjugation, as we see with the lands being taken away from indigenous or Native American people in America, but also here in Canada, and then them being put on reservations. Um, so sort of wrestling with that concept, I think, is part of the indigenous poetry Renaissance, or the idea of blending the panoply of voices and points of view. So it's called polyphonic when you blend various voices, both of the present and of the past. And I think they do that certainly within literature. I know we read a book. A fiction novel in my English 203 class called There by a Native American novelist Tommy Orange, and in the book, each chapter is dedicated to a new voice, a new point of view. And also part of the indigenous poetry Renaissance tradition would be assessing, or sorry, accessing images and themes of nature. Um, and this could be nature with regard to on Earth, but it could be otherworldly as well, almost mystical and mythical. And maybe even the denouncing of what we might call the master narrative or the white power structure would be part of the indigenous poetry or Native American Renaissance. The idea that they were subjugated, they were conquered, and then they were cast aside onto reservations by, not by just an unknown entity, but by the master narrative that is propagated through the white power structure. And we're going to speak about that. We're going to parse from these poems where I think they're addressing the white power structure or the other. Um, this is a concept that emerges out of European colonization, the idea of white power structure and the master narrative, whereby a people have been physically, culturally, and even economically conquered and their lands dispossessed from them. And I think that is some some really strong concepts and themes that are mentioned within the poetry that we're going to read today, this indigenous poetry. Okay, let's take a look at the first indigenous poet. It is Joy Harjo. She is the current poet laureate um, in the United States. So she would have been given that position. It's an honorary position that she would oversee for the entire country, set the pace for and the tempo for, and set the ideas and ideals for what people should be reading. She would travel around to different schools and universities and exposing these individuals across America to poetry, maybe some indigenous poetry, but poetry in general. Okay, let's take a look at one of her poems. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and read this poem aloud, um, and then we'll talk about some of the concepts that I believe adhere and follows suit with regard to the Indigenous Renaissance poetry tradition that we spoke about. So, An American Sunrise by Joy Harjo. We were running out of breath as we ran out to meet ourselves. We were surfacing the edge of our ancestors' fights and ready to strike. It was difficult to lose days in the Indian bar if you were straight. Easy if you played pool and drank to remember to forget. We made plans to be professional and did. And some of us could sing. So we drummed a firelit pathway up to the starry stars. Sin was invented by the Christians, as was the devil, we sang. We were the heathens, but needed to be saved from them. Then chance. We knew we are all related in this story. A little gin will clarify the dark and make us feel like dancing. We had something to do with the origins of blues and jazz. I argued with the Pueblo as I filled the jukebox with dimes in June. 40 years later, and we still want justice. We are still America. We know the rumors of our demise. We spit them out. They die soon. All right. So a lot of things going on in this poem that I really think are strong with regard to the various things we just outlined and as we defined as the Indigenous Renaissance tradition. So we see it happening and exemplified within Harjo's poem, whereby the poet is giving commentary on ideas such as ancestry. We see even the word ancestry she mentions, struggling with some struggle of some sort in the form of a fight. She mentions the word fight. So her ancestral struggle. Ideas of a shared ancestral memory with the words remember to forget, moments of the white power structure as the master narrative by the title America. So we sort of get that white power structure master narrative in America. Because it was called America by Europeans, not by them. And by the allusion to the European religion, Christianity, and the idea of being heathens, right? It comes when they were conquered by Europeans, both Native American and Indigenous and First Nations. They would have been converted to Christianity, that their religion would have been pushed aside. And then we have the idea of death or demise, and even the concept of justice. Justice for what? Freedom to own one's identity when it was stripped away from them by the Europeans. So this poem truly is exemplary of the Native American or Indigenous Renaissance tradition with all of its themes we enumerated. It's interesting too, as Harjo's poem here, she's entering the postmodern stroke, and unless you knew the poem that I'm about to show you that she's alluding to, it would be hard to make connections, and I accidentally stumbled upon it myself. But the poem borrows from an artifact from the past by way of intertextuality. And we talked about postmodernism and using that idea of borrowing something from the past that has built-in meaning and using it in the present to give present meaning into one's work, right? That's called intertextuality, intertexting. So let's take a look at another poet, Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, "We Real Cool," and we'll compare and contrast and see how Harjo is borrowing from that to infuse meaning. All right, so we already read An American Sunrise. You could reread it if you wish, pause it, reread. But I'm going to read "We Real Cool." It's a very famous poem, 60 years ago from when The American Sunrise was written. So, and Joy Harjo mentions that within the poem, An American Sunrise, the idea of 60 years. So it's interesting. One has to question why. So we will in a moment, but let me go ahead and read "We Real Cool" by Gwendolyn Brooks. The Pole Players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. All right, so do you see it? The various elements of language that Harjo is blending into their end-stopped poem, right? So if you look at the line breaks on Harjo's poem to the left, we see we strike straight. I'm just reading from the very end of the sentence. We sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. So she's totally infusing the language and the rhythm at the end of each line, right? At the end stop. And she's doing that by borrowing from the we's, right? If we look at Gwendolyn Brooks' poem at the end of the line, right? The enjambment of we just get the we soon, right? Which is interesting. So, what's the reasoning behind it? Why is she borrowing from this artifact from the past that has built-in meaning about these pole players, seven at the Golden Shovel? I'm guessing the Golden Shovel was a bar, of some sort. Who they think they're cool, but they're gonna end up dying if we want to try to parse meaning from it by living this risky sort of lifestyle. So there's that connection, right? Native Americans, indigenous individuals, First Nations, do they have the tendency maybe to come from disparaging situations? Yeah, they do. Spoke about that novel written by a Native American, Tommy Orange. The large theme that runs the breadth of that novel is the idea of mental health, right? And taking the form of alcoholism, addiction to drugs. So these are part of the community. If you live that sort of lifestyle in any community, you're going to run the risk of cutting your life short. So, but there's also other meaning that we can sort of extrapolate from this. So minority races are going on. So on the right-hand side in Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, we're talking about the Black African American community. Gwendolyn Brooks comes from the Heartland Renaissance that we spoke about before, that tradition of poetry. So she's a Black individual, a Native American, and she's writing on the subject matter of her fellow Native Americans coming from impoverished situations, living risky lifestyles, and running the chance of having an early death. And so definitely Harjo is aware of that and keen to that and is methodically infusing that into her own poem. So minority races being subjected. Why are they impoverished? Because they're subjected maybe to a master narrative that we spoke about before from the white power structure, the European colonization that stemmed from that is most likely the connection or allusion that Harjo wants to make through her intertextuality to this past artifact that is Gwendolyn Brooks's We Real Cool. Okay, let's take a look at another Harjo poem, A Map to the Next World. And then we'll talk about how it fits within the Native American or Indigenous Renaissance tradition. Okay, A Map of the Next World. In the last days of the fourth world, I wish to make a map for those who would climb through the hole in the sky. My only tools were the desires of humans as they emerge from the killing fields, from the bedrooms and the kitchens. For the soul is a wanderer with many hands and feet. The map must be of sand and can't be read by ordinary light. It must carry fire to the next tribal town for renewal of spirit. In the legend are instructions on the language of the land, how it was we forgot to acknowledge the gift, as if we were not in it or of it. Take note of the proliferation of supermarkets and malls, the altars of money. They best describe the detour from grace. Keep track of the errors of our forgetfulness. The fog steals our children while we sleep. Flowers of rage spring up in the depression. Monsters are born, there of nuclear anger. Trees of ashes wave goodbye to goodbye, and the map appears to disappear. We no longer know the names of the birds here, how to speak to them by their personal names. Once we knew everything in the lush promise. What I am telling you is real and is printed in a warning on the map. Our forgetfulness stalks us, walks the earth behind us, leaving a trail of paper diapers, needles, and wasted blood. An imperfect map will have to do, little one. The place of entry is the sea of your mother's blood, your father's small death as he longs to know himself in another. There is no exit. The map can be interpreted through the wall of the intestine, a spiral of the road of knowledge. You will travel through the membrane of death, smell cooking from the encampment where our relatives make a feast of fresh deer meat and corn soup in the Milky Way. They have never left us. We abandon them for science. And when you take your next breath, as we enter the fifth world, there will be no X, no guidebook words you can carry. You will have to navigate by your mother's voice, renew the song she is singing. Fresh courage glimmers from planets and lights up the map printed with the blood of history, a map you will have to know by your intention, by the language of suns. When you emerge, note the tracks of the monster slayers where they entered the cities of artificial light and killed what was killing us. You will see red cliffs. There the heart contained the ladder. A white deal will greet you when the last human climbs from the destruction. Remember the hole of shame, marking the act of abandoning our tribal grounds. We were never perfect, yet the journey we make together is perfect on this earth, who was once a star and made the same mistake as humans. We might make them again, she said. Crucial to finding the way is this. There is no beginning or end. You must make your own map. Okay, wow. A lot of things going on here, I think, with the tradition, the things we spoke about, that is part of the tradition and defining the tradition, the thematic tradition of Indigenous or Native American Renaissance. Um, so we get a really mythical sort of feel to this. She even mentions the stars at some point and the cosmos, this mysticism and mythology, where they come from. And then she talks about sort of addresses without saying it, but she's sort of getting towards that. The idea of this capitalistic, foolish pig traits that we have, right? The idea of putting up malls, and here we go, right here. Take note of the proliferation of supermarkets and malls, the altars of money. We've traded religion for money. They best describe the detour from grace, right? The idea of not connected anymore, the Native Americans, inability to connect anymore to their past traditions because they can't. They've been relinquished and relegated off of their own lands by European colonizations onto reservations. They've been marginalized in society, subjugated, held down by what we spoke about before, the white power structure. It was part of the master narrative. Um, the idea that they can't better themselves and that can't even connect with their own past. They're trying to in this poem. She seems to be saying, the speaker, and Harjo through the speaker, trying to connect with their fathers and their mother's blood, right? This ancestral connection that they want to make, but they can't connect with nature anymore. She gives us some nature imagery within here, the idea of the deer, connecting with that deer, which is like their soul that they had before they were colonized, right? So it's a very interesting themes that really adhere and are exemplary of the Native American or Indigenous poetic Renaissance tradition. Okay, so here we have a poem by a poet, a female poet named Jessica Mehta. So her last name, if you want to look it up, is Mehta. A Native American poet, up and coming. Sort of think she's in her 30s, and she's well known. She's written prolifically for being so young, relatively young. But it's interesting because whereas Harjo, she's carrying on the tradition of Harjo, Mehta is, but Harjo is a little older, right? So it's interesting to get the perspective of various ages, sort of putting together sort of a trajectory and timeline. So in this poem, I'll just go ahead and read it aloud, and then we'll talk about how it adheres to and is a close brand towards the Indigenous Renaissance tradition. So thirsty. I packed my mom in a Tupperware from the dollar store. She always wanted to go to the Bahamas, even before she'd gone to sand, before her bones could be mistaken for broken shells. I don't know if it's bad to divide ashes, leave a slice of femur in the Caribbean foam, a chip of coccyx in the Oregon waterfalls, gushing like overdue orgasms. How does a person want to be after our skins burn to crisps? The only organ capable of holding all our worst messes together. She never said, but I felt her wailing through my insides, demanding turquoise waters, a cleanse, a starting over. But then again, who's surprised? She was always so thirsty. Okay. So within Mehta's poem, we do access, I believe, the Indigenous Renaissance or Native American Renaissance tradition. We get the family, the idea of ancestors, remembering the past, the shared identity and personal identity that we're building, the personal identity from past experiences. And one could say, oh, all poems do that. They build personal identity if we're talking about family members. Well, that's true. They do. But it's really something that runs a thread through the spine of Native American or Indigenous poetry. So that's why it's important. That's why it emerges as a tradition. When it starts to be a pattern that is specifically engaged by Native Americans or Indigenous individuals or First Nations, the idea of personal identity and the loss of personal identity. Some of these individuals that are white, Caucasian individuals that are writing poetry and other people, they're not marginalized. They weren't subjected necessarily to colonization, where you lose you were stripped away for both your land, dispossessed for your land, and you lose your personal identity because of that. And that's another thing they talk about through personal identity is the connection to land, right? Being displaced and yearning for that land again, that personal identity, that shared heritage, that cultural connection to the past. You know what? This is interesting too. I'm going to take a bit of a tangent here. This poem, when I first read it, I was like, wow, okay, I get the connection to indigenous, Renaissance tradition. But also I get the connection to something else, and that is what's called confessional poetry. Uh, and which really focuses on the I. We get I a lot in this poem. We get a strong sense of the speaker through the I. And you don't get that with all poetry, right? So that's why they had to name it part of a tradition called the confessional poetry or confessionalism. It's a style of poetry, confessionalism or confessional poetry is what's traditionally called that emerged in the United States during the 1950s and early 1960s. It is sometimes also classified as a form of postmodernism. It's been described as poetry of the personal or I, focusing on extreme moments of individual experience, is what we see here with Meta's poem. The psyche, personal trauma, I'm sure that emerges here as well, of her mother dying, including previously and occasionally still taboo matters such as mental illness, sexuality. We sort of get that imagery here, and suicide, often set in relation to broader social themes. And we're definitely get the connections to broader social themes here. Uh, the confessional poets engaged with personal experience has been explained by literary critics as an effort to distance oneself from the horrifying social realities of the 20th century. Events like the Holocaust, the Cold War, the existential threat brought by the proliferation of nuclear weapons had made public matters daunting for both confessional poets and their readers. Let's see. The confessional poets also worked in opposition to the idealization of domesticity in the 1950s by revealing unhappiness in their own homes. The school of confessional poetry was associated with several poets who redefined American poetry in the 1950s and 1960s. And these are the typical people you hear swirling around when you hear about confessional poetry. Is Robert Lowell, very famous poet. Sylvia Plath, we're going to look at one of her poems in a moment, and how it can compare and contrast to the voice here in Thirsty. John Berryman, he wrote his famous collection is called Dream Song, and he wrote a poem every day, a short poem, and made it a collection. Let's see, Anne Sexton, very famous female poet, confessional poet. Allen Ginsberg, I think we all know him. And then W.E.D. Snodgrass. Okay, let's take a look at one of these confessional poets, Sylvia Plath, very famous poet, who unfortunately died too early, and we'll look at that in a moment. Okay, here's Sylvia Plath. Although she's not indigenous, she's not Native American, uh, it bears mentioning, that's why I'm going on this tangent, because of the strong I that she uses within her poetry, that it was part of the confessional or confessionalism tradition that I believe we're seeing strongly within Meta's poetry that we just saw with Thirsty. So Plath, just to give you a bit of history, was an American poet. There's a great movie out there. Gwyneth Paltrow plays her in the movie um, called, God, it's called Sylvia. So look it up. Great movie. I'm not sure where it is. Go to your favorite pirate website where you steal movies and watch it. It's worth watching. She was an American poet writing confessional poetry about her personal life, depression, her obsession with death, and that comes out a lot in her poetry, and the struggles of a woman in post-war America. Although, and that was part of the domesticity, the idea of being relegated to the house, right? A woman's, sort of the stereotype that was perpetuated there again by the master narrative that was dictated by the white power structure, even though she was part of it. That the struggle with the idea of having me domesticated in the house, right? Although the time when Plath was writing, women were beginning to reclaim their voting and education rights. Sylvia's poetry and feminism are distinct because of the rage and mental trauma that it embeds. And so you definitely within her poetry you see some of that bleeding through. So Plath was a woman of anger who reclaimed her freedom to express it, even though it was completely opposite to the accepted demurrer of women of this time. So let's take a look at one of her most famous poems. Okay, so we get her poem "Daddy," Sylvia Plath's poem "Daddy," and a lot of it's autobiographical. We're gonna just have some sort of ambiguous moments where we have no idea what she's talking about when she talks about a foot, her dad's foot. But her dad died when she was 8 years old. He had surgery on his foot and he died from like sepsis. Due to that, so some autobiographical information from her past. But I wanted to mention, so Sylvia Plath, it's such a tragedy. She died so early. I think she was in her early 30s. She killed herself. She had two children. Um, and she was in England. She was depressed. She suffered through depression throughout her whole life. And so she was married to Ted Hughes, which was a famous poet, English poet at the time. And they were estranged to each other. They were separated. He left her with the kids. And so what she did was she was so depressed, she put the kids to bed, and then she took towels and taped them around the seal of the door to their bedroom. So and then she turned the gas oven on and let the gas just go until she died of carbon monoxide poisoning. So it's sad, sad situation. Okay, so Daddy, it's a long poem. Some of the wording's kind of tough. It's hard. She's entering different languages within the poem. So we'll go ahead and read it, and we're not going to talk about it. I'm just going to tell you right now, it just connects so well to the last poem we read, The Thirsty, because of the strong eye, the personal trauma that she's accessing through the eye in order to express that personal trauma, right, that we see with the Native American or Indigenous Renaissance tradition. So that's the reason we're reading it. And then we'll move past this and on to a couple more Indigenous poems. So Daddy, Sylvia Plath. You do not do any more, black shoe, in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or atchew. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time. Marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one great toe, big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic, where pores bean green over blue. In the waters of beautiful Nauset, I used to pray to recover you at dew. In the German tongue, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, wars, wars. But the name of the town is common, my Polish friend. Says there are a dozen or two, so I never could tell you where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It stuck in a barbed wire snare. Eek, 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 eek. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you in the language obscene. An engine chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna, are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress, and my weird luck, and my Terapak, I may be a bit of a Jew. I have always been scared of you, with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, and your neat mustache, and your errant eye, bright blue. Panzerman, oh you. Not God, but a swastika, so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist. The boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, and the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that. No, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do, but they pulled me out of the sack, and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black, with a Mein Kampf look, and a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off the route. The voices just can't warm through. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, 7 years if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. Okay, so a strong presence of I within this poem um, that speaks on behalf of past trauma, specifically her father dying. We get allusion to that within this poem. So yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at a couple more Indigenous, what we fall into the tradition of Indigenous Renaissance poetry. Okay, so let's take a look at this poem by Esther Bellen, another very famous Native American poet. And this one's entitled "When Roots Are Exposed." So already with the word roots, we're getting that allusion, that connection to the past, right? Some of the roots. What are we rooted in? Where do we come from? The antecedents of which we spring from. The dirt, our roots. All right. So when roots are exposed, the empty stomach manifests silence, a stillness that levels coffee in a cup, and in a respectful manner allows steam to penetrate the surface. Reversal of action has created my sandstone canyon, rooted cedar and sage at my feet. This movement is where a tranquility stems. When my child creates bubbles through a soapy wand, I occupy the action of fate that bursts the perfect form. An Halcyon, absorbed, nesting within the existence of the form that no longer exists. The formless form is where my mind floats. It is easy to give form, especially with English words, a promotion of mechanical ligaments, binding a spirit with assembly fabricated molds. Just as my hair poses an appendage of my brain, my tongue poses an appendage of my heart. I cannot classify this thought as a typewritten symbol. An ideogram of essence cultivates my stillness to action. All right, so we get the roots. So reaching back to one's past, an ancestral or cultural past now gone, but nonetheless wanting to reach back to it, that we see that idea within the Native American Renaissance or Indigenous Renaissance tradition. But that idea is also made available through a very specific word within the poem, and that's halcyon, which means denoting a period of time in the past that was idyllically happy or peaceful. So this idea of wanting to return normality to one's existence, right? And then we even get the idea of English in the third section, right? Third stanza, but also she enumerates them, so it's really a third section for whatever reason. So we get the idea of promotion of, it is easy to give form, especially with English words, a promotion of mechanical ligaments, binding spirit with assembly fabricated molds. And then that the idea of English, meaning, well, we were colonized, Native Americans and indigenous peoples were in First Nations, and had forced to speak another tongue, which was English. And then at the end, we get cultivates my stillness to action. So her being inactive or inert, and now to action, the action that we see that is part of the heritage, resistance heritage, cultural heritage of Native Americans, I think is prolific in places within this. And the want for a past, to redeem one's past, right? We get that through the halcyon, the wanting to have again that past that was idyllically happy and peaceful. All right, so here's another one by Esther Bellen. And it's interesting because it's so urgent and timely. It's about COVID-19. It's her writing a poem in reaction to COVID-19. And I'm not even sure if it was published other than on this website. But it's interesting that she's going to write about it. And she's going to enter concepts here that has to do with the Native American or Indigenous Renaissance tradition. That is, she's implicating society at large for reservations, individuals on reservations, Native Americans on reservations being decimated, populations being decimated by COVID-19 because they are sort of a second citizenry. Even when the vaccines comes out, you think it's going to go to the Navajo nations first? No, it's going to be part of regular society first, and that's a shame. That's part of the master narrative that's being perpetuated. Okay, so believe. Afterward, we will get up all together with the sound of a canyon wind howling, red clay, mask preserving our faces, our government clothes tattered, no longer creased with false doctrine. The pressurized steamed language escapes from the pores in our skin. The monogrammed label, property of U.S. government, erased from memory. Our teeth, sweat, saliva, fingernails, strands of hair, recompose as daughter of the first man and first woman. The four support pillars reconfigure the directional mountains, the zenith and the nadir bolt lightning into our backbone. The stone knife in our hand slays monsters. The sun rays fasten us snugly to Nahasdazan. The rainbow tethers a shield over us. All together, the intertwined winds breathe again. All right, wow, a lot of allusion to the white power structure with the property of the government, right? The idea of their tattered government clothes. And as you can see here, they even the person who goes on, probably not Esther, but goes on to give commentary and indictment on government, on society for COVID-19, how it continues to have a severe toll on the Navajo Nation with 500 deaths. And I don't know what the date of this is, but yeah, it's interesting how even now, some of the poems I've read to you today are from 10, 15 years ago. One was 20 years ago, but it's still right now, the Native American Indigenous Renaissance tradition is still poignant and still thriving, as we can see here within this poem, Believe. Okay, final poem for today that adheres and is exemplary of the Indigenous or Native American Renaissance tradition. Okay, we have Filament by Armand Garnett Rufo, and he he's a Canadian Indigenous writer. And a scholar within Canada, born and raised in northern Ontario. Uh, of the Ojibwe tribe, First Nations tribe. Okay, so we're going to read it, filament, and then we'll talk about it, how it adheres to the Native American or Indigenous poetic tradition. So, filament. Always that spectral fragment, filament of line cast back there, where open-mouthed fish rise to gulp down shiny lures. I sang once in an auditorium to almost empty rows. I looked for my people in the seats, under the seats, behind the seats, but they weren't there. I called the three people who were there to come up and introduce themselves. They were young aspirants. They talked about themselves, their professional websites. They talked about their astronomical aspirations. What they didn't talk about is why. Maja, time collapses everything. Origami people, we're all eventually blown away into uncertainty. Azigawi, is that how you say it? It's that too. We all return, if only by the stars. For a while we thought we could change the world. For a while we thought we had a place in the world. The offers came, good ones, corner offices, security, mortgages, investments, cars, boats, houses, memberships, to health clubs, fan clubs, promotion, seduction, reduction. Fame, fame, fame. He says, business is business. She says, look at me. I say, it was planned and bound to happen. Together we held the thrashing fish in our hands and felt the world slip. Okay, wow. So yeah, it's a powerful poem. It has powerful moments in it. But he's in this auditorium, um, and let's look at the first opening stanza. This couplet, always that spectral fragment, filament of line cast back there. So back there in the past, referencing the past, his ancestry, and we're going to see that when we get the language later on, right? The native language. Where open-mouthed fish rise to gulp down shiny lures. What are those lures? Those shiny lures, right? I think he's hinting at it when he gets to here, all right? Through colonization, Western philosophy, and Western society, we've been promised these things, a bill of goods, really, mortgages, investments, high implication on capitalism, right? As it being thrown in sharp relief in contrast to being Native American or Indigenous. Um, let's see, an empty auditorium, nobody's there. He's looking for his people. Where could he find them? He finds three people. They're not his people. So he's talking about who his people are. Presumably a powwow, right? They take place all the time, most of the time, sorry, in auditoriums, right? Um, Thought we could change the world for a while. Thought we had a place in the world. So they don't have any place in the world, really, right? Because they've been um, sort of disenfranchised, taken off their lands, and placed and subjugated onto reservations. So a lot of commentary going on that definitely, this is probably one of the strongest examples we looked at today, that really adheres to the Native American or Indigenous Renaissance tradition. Okay, as always, please email me if you have any questions, concerns, points of clarification that you need, anything you need to talk about. So just looking forward, we only have a couple more classes left, and then we're done. I mean, the semester, it moved fast, and then for me it moved slowly, and then it moved fast again, and we're definitely at that accelerated speed now. We're going to review Japanese poetic forms, kind of like we did here. We'll go through a couple examples, define what it is, go through some examples that are very sort of exemplary of that tradition, the Japanese poetic tradition. And there's many poetic forms in Japanese that Japanese poetry adheres to, not just what we know of as haiku, right? There's haibun, there's waka, there's many others that we're going to go through. And then we have an Elements of Poetry test on December 3rd. This could be a multiple choice test on Blackboard. You go on Blackboard. Can't remember. It's over 20 questions. I know that much. And then December 8th, the final essay will be due via Blackboard, but I'll send instructions on that, so don't concern yourself with that just yet. But start thinking about what you want to write about. You can write about any of the texts that we covered this semester, as long as it doesn't overlap too much with what you've written on in the past. So if you've written your last essay on here bullet and you want to extend that essay out, it has to change the thesis statement. The substance of the essay has to change enough that it differentiates itself from whatever you've written prior, okay? You can't just add on 2 pages onto your final essay, onto a prior essay and call it final, right? So just think about that and email me if you have any questions. Okay, bye. Talk to you later. Bye.